It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in mathematics and computer science now for about 10 years. I currently teach cryptography at Columbia, and I also work for a US stock exchange called IEX. And I feel like in the space of women in mathematics and women in STEM, we've been having, at least in the US, the same conversation for these past 10 years. And at this point, we've kind of reached diminishing returns in the raising of awareness. Everybody's pretty aware of the problem. But I think the way we're setting up this conversation, the way we're framing it, is not really setting us up for success. Because we're talking about the problem, but we're not really talking about the consequences of not fixing the problem. So something I want to touch upon today is from maybe a more corporate perspective, why should we care about diversity in tech? We certainly care as human beings who want to work in tech, who want good work environments. But in terms of the outputs of the technology industry, we tend to, in these conversations, fall into a common trap, which is that if you start with the premise that perhaps women at least sometimes think differently than men, then underrepresentation can be justified by this concept of merit. And on the other side, if you accept the premise that women think the same as men, then underrepresentation seems not as important unless you sort of tell the story that is often told about the shortage of skilled workers, particularly in the US, to take these jobs. And I think that that skill shortage is certainly a true narrative and an important narrative, but sort of focusing on that obscures what I think might be one of the more important drivers of urgency in fixing this problem, which is that it's not just about getting bodies, qualified bodies into these positions, but it's actually about the way that those people in these positions think and the kind of products and technology that they will produce as a result of those thought processes. And a lot of this comes down to the illusion of this concept of merit. So I think merit is probably something we think of as a static metric, but it's more of a quantum kind of phenomenon for the scientists in the room, which means that to measure it is to change it. So we often say in statistics that as soon as you make something a metric, it becomes not very useful. And this is certainly true in finance or many other fields. As soon as you enshrine something as a goal, people sort of adjust their behavior to optimize to it, and it becomes less of a proxy for the thing that you were trying to measure in the first place. And so certainly in technology, as with any other field, merit is not a static objective target. Most technology about trade-offs. It makes certain things easier, it makes certain things harder. And I think companies fall into this trap by thinking that diversity of thought is something they can achieve by just having smart people in the room. But this is not really a substitute for true diversity of experience. And a tech team that actually has to work harder to communicate because of having less in common might actually produce better technology, especially in a world where we have cybersecurity concerns, because they can more broadly anticipate the different kind of ways that people are going to interact with and use the technology if there's diversity in their own personal experiences, and there's less shared assumptions between them that sort of get ignored in the development and testing process. So to really illustrate this, I want to tell you a story that happened in the US a few years ago of this quiet farm in Kansas. So there was this farm in Kansas owned by a family for over 100 years. As far away from the beaten path where not much happens, and this woman who owned it was renting it out to a couple, and they all started getting these sort of strange phone calls. So at first the woman got a call claiming that the computer in her house had caused a denial of service attack against an email service by this business owner. And she was very confused because she only uses her computer to compose Sunday school lessons. And then they started getting calls from FBI investigators claiming that nefarious activity had been tracked to the house, started getting ambulances showing up ready to save suicidal people, get cops knocking on the door all the time, people accusing her and her renters of all sorts of activity. And what they discovered was that there was a company claiming to map IP addresses to physical locations that had designed their software such that in order for it to work properly, it always spit back out a specific latitude and longitude, regardless of how confident it was in that answer. And so just to bring home exactly how strange this behavior was, they actually one day received a toilet dropped in the front yard there with no explanation. And this was all happening because somebody who designed a database didn't think it was important to communicate to the users the sort of inherent uncertainty of that answer. And so when the only thing it could determine about the IP address was that it was somewhere in the US, it would map it to the specific location in Kansas which was quite near the center of the country up to a rounding that made it convenient for the units that they were using. So when a reporter eventually discovered this, they went through the database and they found that there were over 600 million IP addresses that this company had mapped to that specific address. And in dealing with the fallout of this, so there was a lawsuit going through the courts. The owner of the company said that the default location in Kansas was chosen over 10 years ago when the company was started. At that time, we picked a latitude and longitude that was in the center of the country, and it didn't occur to us that people would use the database to attempt to locate people down to a household level. We have always advertised the database as determining the location down to a city or zip code level. To my knowledge, we have never claimed that our database could be used to locate a household. Which is not really a comforting answer for the people that spent years dealing with the physical consequences of this miscommunication in cyberspace. And I think what commonly happens in our race to innovate in technology and our race to build things as quickly as possible and make them work as seamlessly as possible, what seems at first like an unimportant edge case when the software can't exactly determine a location, gets missed and gets dismissed as not important compared to the main use case of the software, which is trying to identify IP addresses when it is possible to track it to a location. But what we call edge cases and what we call average use cases is very much a matter of perspective. And if the perspective of the people in the room is pretty uniform, then it's going to drive a certain direction in the development of technology. This particularly annoys me in the cybersecurity world when we often see, one thing that's good lately is we have a lot more increased interest in cybersecurity and people looking for practical tips for how to secure their data. That's great. Often these practical tips are given from a particular perspective. So for instance, this is a New York Times article from a little while ago that recommended writing your passwords down on a Post-it note at home, since it seems more far-fetched that a hacker would bother to break into your home for a Post-it note than find a way into your computer. Which might be true from a certain perspective and situation about threat modeling, but it ignores a very big reality in the US that a lot of the threats in terms of our personal data, especially our location data and our passwords, come from people in our lives that are very close to us, that may live inside our homes, for instance. So some stats in the US from 2010, 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men will be stalked in their lifetime. This is something that geographic location data can easily put on steroids if we aren't careful about it, which we are not. And 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. And so if you're devising things like best practices for how people to manage passwords, it might be good to have someone like this in the room to think about and bring up these kind of threat models of who our adversary is. So at the end of the day, in cryptography, a large principle of what we're doing and thinking rigorously about cryptography is we're always trying to build systems that carefully separate the functionalities that we want to allow that are supposed to be part of the proper operation of the system from the attacks that we want to prevent. And in that is an implicit and important choice of how to define an attack, how to define the capabilities of the attacker, and how to define the goals and access of the attacker. So your concept of what is a good behavior and what is a bad behavior, what is a likely scenario, what is an unlikely scenario, drives all of your decisions in this trade-off space of how you design your systems and technology. So it's not the case that if we put equally smart people in a room and give them this kind of task that they will all converge to the same answer. They're going to naturally gravitate towards different points in this trade-off space. And to give you an example of sort of what's out there for somebody who might have a bit of a different threat model, so these are tips from an organization in New York that advises women trying to survive domestic violence situations, and it has to make them aware of issues with online safety, and it gives them advice such that your computer's online browsing history can never be completely removed, which is important to know, but it doesn't really give you a way to get around that. And we don't really see a lot of cybersecurity researchers and tools being developed for these kind of use cases, which sadly are not at all uncommon. So we see some examples of innovation in this. So for instance, a lot of these websites for these kind of organizations that help people who are in these risky situations have things like escape buttons at the top of the website that allows you to exit quickly to some innocuous landing page if somebody enters the room. We could do much better than this in general. We could do this kind of thing on smartphones. So imagine also for things like government surveillance, if when someone forces you to give your social media password, or someone forces you to enter your code on a smartphone, we could build a tool, let's say, that allows it to represent multiple personalities on the phone controlled by different passcodes, so that under duress you can sort of bring up some kind of fake image of the phone that would look completely plausible as a realistic user, and it could help you defend against these kind of scenarios. So is that the direction that we're going in tech? Not really. So from just a few days ago, there's an announcement about how Apple is making password management easier, which some aspects of which are great. But so this was an announcement of how it's going to work. So note that after this would integrate password managers into your iPhone, such that passwords would be offered as suggestions when a user is prompted to fill in the password information. They showed a demo of this where after entering the username for an account, a prompt appears above the keyboard saying that there is a password stored for the site. The user is then able to use Face ID to confirm their identity, and the password is automatically filled in. So if we go on and look at the interpretation of this in this particular report, they're saying that if just a fraction of users adopt this and use more password management strategies, then users will be better protected against the repercussion of hacks and data breaches, which is again true from a certain perspective of what the threat is. Face ID inherently is a bit of an issue for coercive relationships and surveillance kind of relationships where, you know, a police officer or partner or someone can hold the phone up to your face and force you to authenticate. So we're not really seeing much evidence that in these kind of trade-off decisions and designs that all these different scenarios are really being considered and that users are really not being empowered to choose the points in the trade-off space that make the most sense for them. Instead, they're getting offered this menu of choices that are designed to be useful for people with very different sort of threat modeling in different use cases. And so just to wrap it up, I think we live in this world where there's a perception that technology is about merit or that technology is about progress. But really we need to realize that technology is about trade-offs. Trade-offs between usability and security, privacy and personalization, information and entertainment, et cetera. And whose interests are served by which trade-offs we make in this space are really important. And that's why underrepresentation is not just a problem of bodies in the jobs, it's actually a problem of the technology that's going to be built.